A poor old woman is denied a first-class seat. Moments later, the pilot makes a shocking announcement. The airport was buzzing with impatient travelers, rushing through security, checking their watches and waiting to board. Among them stood Margaret Walker, an elderly woman with silver hair tucked neatly under a simple hat. She clutched a small, well-worn purse and held her boarding pass with slightly trembling fingers. She wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. She was just another passenger. At the gate, Margaret approached the airline attendant with a polite smile. "Excuse me, dear. I believe there's been a mistake. I was told I had a seat in first class." The young attendant barely looked up, her fingers tapping rapidly on the keyboard. "Your ticket says economy, ma'am. If there was an upgrade, it would show here." Margaret hesitated, her heart sinking. She wasn't asking for luxury. She wasn't expecting special treatment. She had been promised the seat. A businessman in a sleek suit nearby scoffed loudly. "Come on, lady. We all paid for first class. You don't just get a free upgrade because you asked nicely." Passengers around her murmured in agreement. Some rolled their eyes. Others avoided looking at her altogether. Margaret lowered her gaze. "I understand," she whispered, clutching her purse a little tighter. The attendant waved her through without another glance. She wasn't important enough to argue over. Margaret made her way down the jet bridge, her small frame moving carefully through the narrow aisle toward her cramped economy seat, sandwiched between two restless travelers. She sank into it, adjusting, her hat forcing a small smile. She didn't complain. She never did. Then, just as the last passengers were settling in, the intercom crackled to life. A deep, steady voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we take off, there has been a change in seating arrangements." Passengers exchanged confused glances. Then came the words that made everyone freeze. "Would Mrs. Margaret Walker please come to the front of the plane?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She looked around, confused. Had she misheard? A flight attendant appeared beside her, smiling warmly. "Mrs. Walker, the captain has requested you come to the front," passengers whispered. Some looked annoyed, others curious. The businessman who had scoffed at her earlier sat up straighter, his smirk fading. Margaret hesitated before rising to her feet. All eyes were on her now. She clutched her purse, making her way slowly toward the curtain separating economy from first class. A flight attendant pulled it back, revealing the luxurious seats, spacious and comfortable, a world away from where she had just been. Then, the cockpit door opened. A tall man in uniform stepped out, removing his pilot's hat as he looked at her with an expression filled with something deeper than just kindness. "Respect." "Mrs. Walker," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you." Margaret frowned slightly, confused. "I'm sorry, dear. Do I know you?" The captain's lips curved into a soft smile. "No, ma'am, but you knew my mother." A ripple of shock spread through the cabin. Passengers leaned forward, intrigued. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "Your mother?" The captain nodded. "Her name was Eleanor Carter, and because of you she got a second chance at life." Margaret's heart pounded. She remembered. It was decades ago. A cold night in the city. A young woman, barely in her 20s, sitting on a bench, shivering in the rain. Margaret had stopped. She had asked if she was all right. She wasn't. She had nowhere to go. No family, no home, no future. Margaret didn't hesitate. She took the woman to a small diner, bought her a hot meal, and paid for a room at a nearby inn. She gave her the only advice she could. "When you get back on your feet, do the same for someone else." The captain knelt beside Margaret's seat, his voice quiet but firm. "My mother never forgot what you did for her. Because of you, she went back to school. She became a teacher. She built a life, and she raised me to always repay kindness." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She had never expected to hear those words. She had helped because it was the right thing to do. She never imagined it would come back to her decades later, at 30,000 feet in the air. The captain exhaled, standing tall. Then, turning to the passengers, he made an announcement that left them speechless. "Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the honor of returning the kindness my mother once received. For the remainder of this flight, Mrs. Walker will be my guest in first class." The businessman shifted uncomfortably. The passengers who had dismissed her lowered their gazes. Margaret, overwhelmed, shook her head. "Oh dear, I couldn't possibly." The captain placed his pilot's hat in her hands. "My mother would have wanted this." For the first time in a long time, Margaret allowed herself to accept kindness as Margaret settled into her first-class seat. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely changed. Passengers weren't just watching, they were reflecting. The businessman, now unusually quiet, finally spoke. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "I shouldn't have assumed." Margaret simply smiled. "It's never too late to see people differently, dear." A young mother nearby adjusted her sleeping toddler and whispered, "I want my son to grow up knowing people like you exist." Margaret chuckled softly. "Kindness is everywhere, my dear. You just have to look for it." The businessman suddenly reached into his wallet, but this time, not for himself. He scribbled on a check and handed it to a flight attendant. "For Mrs. Walker," he said, donating to the flight crew in her honor. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. She never needed recognition. She never needed a fancy seat, but she had won something far greater, the hearts of the people around her. As the plane landed, she walked toward the exit, clutching the pilot's hat. And then, it happened. Applause. The passengers, who once barely noticed her, clapped, not because she had demanded respect, not because she had fought for it, but because she had earned it. As Margaret stepped into the terminal, she smiled to herself. Kindness never truly disappears. Sometimes, it just finds its way home. Kindness is a currency that never loses its value. What Margaret gave decades ago came back to her when she least expected it. And now, it's our turn. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, don't let it stop here. Pass it forward. Leave a comment about a time when someone's kindness changed your life. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, hit the like button so more people can see it. Subscribe, because we're just getting started, and the next story might be the one you never knew you needed. And remember, kindness is never wasted. It always finds its way home.